March 15th, 1859. Magnolia Grove Plantation, just outside Natchez, Mississippi. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields like a shroud, and the air carried more than just the scent of blooming jasmine. It carried whispers. Whispers that would grow into accusations so horrific they would shake the very foundations of the antebellum South. Inside the grand plantation house, Master Edmund Blackwood lay dying, his body racked with fever and mysterious ailments that no doctor could explain. But it wasn't his illness that terrified the household. It was what the field hands claimed to have seen in the kitchen after dark. Jeremiah Brooks, the head cook, moved through the shadows of the kitchen house like a man carrying secrets heavier than cast iron. For 15 years, he had prepared every meal, seasoned every dish, carved every piece of meat that graced the Blackwood table. His hands knew the weight of every spice, but now of every knife, the heat of every flame. The taste those same hands were suspected of something far more sinister than simple cooking. They whispered that Jeremiah had been serving more than just pork and beef to the master's family. They whispered that he had found a way to make the missing disappear forever, one meal at a time. Before we dive deeper into this tale of horror and suspicion, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about survival, revenge, and the lengths to which desperation can drive a human soul. The kitchen at Magnolia Grove stood apart from the main house, connected only by a covered walkway that seemed to stretch like a bridge between two worlds. One world of crystal chandeliers and silk curtains, the other of smoke, sweat, and secrets. The building itself was older than the plantation, its brick walls blackened by decades of cooking fires, its wooden floors worn smooth by countless feet. But it was what happened inside those walls that would become the stuff of nightmares. Jeremiah had arrived at Magnolia Grove in the spring of 1844, a young man barely 20 years old, sold from a failing tobacco farm in Virginia. He came with a reputation, not for violence or rebellion, but for something rarer and more valuable. He could cook, not just the simple fare of cornbread and salt pork, but elaborate dishes that would make a plantation mistress weep with joy. Roasted duck with blackberry glaze, beef tenderloin with herbs that seemed to dance on the tongue, soups so rich they could make a man forget his troubles. Edmund Blackwood paid top dollar for Jeremiah, and for good reason. The kitchen became Jeremiah's kingdom. He ruled over it with quiet authority, training younger slaves in the art of flame and seasoning, organizing the pantries with military precision, and above all, feeding the insatiable appetite of the Blackwood family. They were gluttons, every one of them. Master Edmund could consume an entire roasted chicken at a single sitting. His wife, Cordelia, had a weakness for rich desserts that left her gasping for breath. Their 3 sons ate like wolves, tearing through platters of meat with savage enthusiasm. And Jeremiah fed them all, day after day, year after year, watching their faces flush with satisfaction as they consumed his creations. But something changed in the winter of 1858. It started with the disappearances. First, it was old Moses, a field hand who had grown too weak for cotton picking. He simply vanished one morning, his bunk empty, his few possessions left behind. The overseer claimed he had run off, but the other slaves knew better. Moses couldn't have made it to the property line on his swollen legs, much less to freedom. Then came Sarah, a young woman who had been caught stealing bread from the kitchen. She was there for her whipping at dawn, gone by sunset. No goodbye, no trace, just an empty space where a person used to be. The pattern continued through the long, cold months. A troublemaker here, a sick worker there, always someone the master would not miss, someone whose absence could be explained away with shrugs and lies. By spring, 7 people had vanished from Magnolia Grove, swallowed by the earth or the night or something far worse. The remaining slaves began to whisper among themselves huddled in their quarters after the work bell rang, sharing fears that grew with each passing day. It was little Tom, a boy who worked in the stables, who first spoke the unspeakable. He had been returning late from the fields, carrying feed for the horses, when he saw Jeremiah behind the kitchen house. The cook was dragging something heavy, something wrapped in burlap, toward the smokehouse. The bundle was the size and shape of a person, and when the wind caught the cloth, Tom swore he saw a human hand hanging limp in the moonlight. He ran back to the quarters, heart pounding, and told what he had seen. The others listened in horror, pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. Why had the meat been so abundant lately? Why had Jeremiah insisted on preparing all the dishes himself, allowing no one else near the cooking pots? Why had he started locking the smokehouse, keeping the only key on a chain around his neck? And most disturbing of all, why had Master Blackwood been praising the meals so highly, claiming the meat had never tasted so rich, so satisfying, so perfectly seasoned? The whispers grew into murmurs, the murmurs into accusations. Jeremiah felt the change in the air, like a coming storm. The other slaves avoided his eyes, stepped aside when he passed, crossed themselves when they thought he wasn't looking. Children who once begged for scraps from his kitchen now ran when they saw him coming. Even the dogs seemed nervous around him, whimpering and backing away from his outstretched hand. But Jeremiah continued his work as if nothing had changed. Every morning he rose before dawn and lit the fires. He prepared the breakfast, carried the trays to the big house, returned to begin the preparations for the midday meal. His movements were the same, his recipes unchanged, his face a mask of calm professionalism. If he knew what they were saying about him, he gave no sign. He simply cooked, as he always had, feeding the endless hunger of the Blackwood family. The truth was more complex than the whispers suggested, more terrible than even the slaves dared imagine. Jeremiah had indeed been disposing of the missing people, but not in the way they thought. He had been burying them in the deep woods beyond the cotton fields, in graves so carefully concealed that no one would ever find them. But the meat that graced the Blackwood table was still pork and beef, still chicken and duck. The horror lay not in what he was feeding them, but in what he was planning to feed them. For 15 years, Jeremiah had watched the Blackwood family feast on the fruits of slave labor. He had seen children sold away from their mothers, had watched men work to death in the fields, had witnessed beatings that left permanent scars on bodies and souls. He had served meals to guests who spoke casually of buying and selling human beings like livestock, had listened to dinner conversations about the best methods for breaking a rebellious spirit. And through it all, he had smiled, bowed, and returned to his kitchen to prepare the next course. The missing slaves had not been victims of his appetite. They had been victims of his mercy. Each one had been dying, suffering from injuries or illnesses that would have meant slow, agonizing deaths. Moses with his swollen legs and labored breathing. Sarah with the infection that was eating away at her insides after a brutal assault. Others whose bodies were failing, whose spirits were already broken beyond repair. Jeremiah had given them what the plantation would never offer: quick, painless deaths in the darkness of the woods. But now, with Master Blackwood growing sicker by the day, Jeremiah was preparing that would make the Wiss something different. Something purrs about cannibalism seemed like gentle bedtime stories compared to the reality of his plan. He had been patient for 15 years, learning, watching, waiting for the perfect moment. And that moment was almost here. The ingredients were already prepared, hidden in jars and pouches throughout his kitchen. Not human flesh, but something far more insidious. Plants gathered from the deepest parts of the swamp, roots that his grandmother had taught him to identify in the years before he was sold. Leaves that looked harmless, but carried death in their veins. Seeds that would dissolve in broth without changing the taste, but would slowly, systematically destroy a man from the inside out. Master Blackwood's illness was no mystery. It was the first course of Jeremiah's final meal, a dish that had been simmering for months, building in intensity with each passing day. Soon, very soon, the master would take his last bite, and Jeremiah would finally serve the justice that had been denied for far too long. The whispers about cannibalism would pale in comparison to the truth about what was really happening in the kitchen at Magnolia Grove. The slaves feared they were living with a monster who consumed human flesh. They had no idea they were living with something far more dangerous, a man who had learned to cook revenge itself, seasoning it with patience and serving it with a smile that never wavered. The servants' quarters buzzed with nervous energy as word spread like wildfire through the slave community. The accusations against Jeremiah had taken on a life of their own, growing more elaborate and horrifying with each retelling. Some claimed they had seen him sharpening knives by candlelight, testing the edges against his thumb until blood dripped onto the wooden cutting board. Others swore they had witnessed him talking to the meat as he carved it, whispering names of the missing as if conducting some dark ritual. But it was Mama Ruth, the oldest woman on the plantation, who spoke the words that chilled everyone to their bones. She had lived through 60 years of bondage, had seen every kind of cruelty the human heart could devise, and nothing had ever frightened her quite like this. Sitting in her rocking chair on the porch of her cabin, surrounded by the younger women who sought her wisdom, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "That man ain't just cooking food no more," she said, her cloudy eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the kitchen house chimney. "He's cooking souls. Every bite they take, they swallowing the spirit of someone we loved. That's why Master Blackwood looks so strange lately, why his eyes got that wild look. He eating our people, and they crying out from inside his belly." The women crossed themselves and muttered prayers, but Ruth wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her gnarled fingers gripping the arms of her chair. "I seen this before, down in Louisiana. Man went mad with grief after his children they stole. Started putting things in the food, things that weren't meant for eating. By the time they figured it out, half the plantation was sick, with something that wouldn't heal. But this here, this different. This ain't madness. This revenge." Her words spread through the quarters like smoke, seeping into every conversation, every worried glance, every sleepless night. The fear was palpable now, thick as molasses and twice as dark. Children refused to eat anything that might have come from Jeremiah's kitchen. Adults picked at their meager rations with suspicious eyes, examining every grain of rice, every scrap of meat for signs of something that didn't belong. Meanwhile, in the big house, the Blackwood family continued their nightly feasts, oblivious to the terror growing just beyond their walls. Master Edmund, despite his declining health, still demanded elaborate meals, still praised Jeremiah's cooking with the enthusiasm of a man who had found his greatest pleasure in life. His appetite remained voracious, even as his body grew weaker, as if the act of eating was the only thing keeping him tethered to the world. Cordelia Blackwood had begun to notice changes in her husband's behaviour, subtle shifts that made her increasingly uncomfortable. He had always been a heavy eater, but now he consumed his meals with an almost desperate intensity, as if each bite might be his last. He would sit at the head of the dining room table, sawing through thick cuts of meat with methodical precision, chewing slowly, savouring every morsel with his eyes closed, in what looked almost like ecstasy. "Edmund," she had said to him just the night before, her voice tight with concern. "Perhaps you should eat more lightly. The doctor said your constitution needs rest." He had looked at her then with eyes that seemed to burn from within, his face flushed from the rich food and wine. "The doctor doesn't understand," he had replied, his voice hoarse but determined. "This food, Cordelia, it's the finest I've ever tasted. Jeremiah has outdone himself. I've never felt so satisfied, so complete, full." But even as he spoke those words, his hands trembled slightly as they gripped his fork and knife. Dark circles had formed under his eyes, and his skin had taken on a yellowish tinge that no amount of rouge could disguise. Whatever was happening to him was accelerating, and Cordelia found herself lying awake at night, listening to his laboured breathing, and wondering if her husband was slowly losing his mind. The three Blackwood sons had noticed the change in their father as well, but their concerns were more practical than emotional. Robert, the eldest, worried about the plantation's management. Charles, the middle son, fretted about their social standing in Natchez society. And William, the youngest, simply wanted his inheritance secured before whatever was afflicting his father could spread to the rest of the family. They gathered in Robert's study one evening after dinner, speaking in hushed tones while their father retired to his bedroom with another bottle of wine. The room smelled of tobacco and leather, the walls lined with books that none of them had ever read, inherited from previous generations, who had valued learning as much as land ownership. "He's getting worse," Charles said, loosening his collar as he poured himself a generous measure of bourbon. "Did you see how he ate tonight? Like a man possessed. And the way he kept praising that cook, going on and on about the seasoning, the tenderness of the meat. It's not natural." Robert nodded grimly, his face grave in the lamplight. "I've been thinking the same thing. Father's always enjoyed his food, but this is something else entirely. It's as if he can't stop himself, as if he's compelled to eat everything Jeremiah puts in front of him." William, barely 20 and still soft around the edges, despite his father's attempts to toughen him, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "What if the slaves are right?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if there's something wrong with the food itself? What if Jeremiah is putting something in it?" His brothers exchanged glances, the same thought having occurred to both of them. It seemed impossible, almost too fantastic to believe, but the evidence was mounting. Their father's strange behaviour, his increasing dependence on Jeremiah's cooking, his refusal to eat anything prepared by anyone else. And then there were the disappearances, the whispered conversations among the slaves, the way even the house servants had begun to avoid the kitchen when Jeremiah was working. "We need proof," Robert said finally, his voice carrying the authority of the eldest son. "We can't accuse a slave of poisoning our father without evidence. The scandal alone would destroy us. But if there's even a chance that something unnatural is happening in that kitchen, we have to know." Charles drained his glass and set it down with a sharp click. "I'll watch him. Tomorrow night, I'll find a way to observe his preparations. If he's adding something to father's food, I'll see it." But Jeremiah was already 3 steps ahead of them, had been from the moment he first noticed the change in their behaviour. He had survived 15 years of bondage by reading faces, by understanding the subtle shifts in mood and intention that could mean the difference between a whipping and a meal. He knew they suspected him, could see it in the way they glanced toward the kitchen, in the hushed conversations that stopped when he entered a room. This only made his work more urgent, more precise. The final phase of his plan was already in motion, the ingredients carefully measured and prepared, the timing calculated down to the hour. Master Blackwood's death would come soon, but it would not be the quick, merciful end he had given to the others. This would be slow, deliberate, a masterpiece of culinary vengeance that would take weeks to fully appreciate. The irony was not lost on him that they suspected cannibalism, that they imagined him feeding their loved ones to the family that had destroyed so many lives. If only they knew the truth was far more elegant, far more fitting. He was indeed feeding Master Blackwood pieces of the dead, but not their flesh. He was feeding him their suffering, their despair, their final moments of agony, all distilled into powders and extracts that would slowly transform the man's body into a living tomb. Each meal was a symphony of carefully orchestrated destruction, building to a crescendo that would leave Master Blackwood begging for the peace that only death could bring. And when it was over, when the master finally drew his last tortured breath, Jeremiah would serve one final dish to the remaining family members, a feast that would ensure the Blackwood name died with them, buried forever beneath the weight of their own cruelty. The kitchen had become his laboratory, his sanctuary, his temple of justice. And soon, very soon, the work of 15 years would reach its terrible, perfect conclusion. The next morning brought a heavy fog that seemed to cling to Magnolia Grove like guilt made manifest. The air was thick enough to taste, carrying with it the mingled sense of dying jasmine and something else, something metallic that made the slaves hurry past the kitchen house with their heads down and their prayers whispered fast. Inside the big house, Master Blackwood had taken to his bed, his body racked with tremors that no amount of laudanum could still. Dr. Henley arrived from Natchez just after dawn, his black bag heavy with bottles and instruments that promised healing but delivered only confusion. He was a thin man with nervous hands and tired eyes, the kind of physician who had seen too much suffering and learned to charge accordingly. The Blackwood family paid well, which meant he would stay as long as necessary, even if he suspected the case was already lost. "His pulse is erratic," the doctor murmured to Cordelia as they stood outside Edmund's bedroom door. "The fever comes and goes, but there's something else. Something I've never encountered before. His body seems to be fighting itself, as if his very blood has turned poison." Cordelia pressed a handkerchief to her nose, trying to block out the smell that had begun to emanate from her husband's room. It wasn't the typical odour of sickness, of sweat and medicine and approaching death. This was something fouler, something that reminded her of meat left too long in the sun, of flowers rotting in stagnant water. What could cause such a thing, she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Dr. Henley shook his head, his expression troubled. "I've seen similar symptoms in cases of slow poisoning, but nothing quite like this. The progression is too methodical, too deliberate. If I didn't know better, I'd say someone was orchestrating this illness, controlling its pace and intensity with remarkable precision." The word poisoning hung in the air between them like a curse. Cordelia felt her knees weaken, her vision blur at the edges. The whispers from the slave quarters, the strange behaviour of their cook, her husband's unnatural appetite for Jeremiah's food. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. "You think someone is deliberately making him ill?" she whispered. "I think someone is making him die," the doctor replied grimly. "The question is whether we can discover who and how before it's too late." But Jeremiah knew it was already too late. Had been from the moment Master Blackwood took his first bite of the tainted feast 3 months ago. The cook moved through his domain with the calm satisfaction of an artist nearing the completion of his masterpiece. Every pot, every pan, every utensil was positioned exactly where it needed to be. The herbs hung in perfect rows, their leaves dry and brittle, ready to crumble into powder at the slightest touch. He had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, 15 years of swallowed rage and buried grief teaching him that true revenge was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was a slow burn, a careful cultivation of suffering that would bloom into something beautiful and terrible. Master Blackwood's death would be a work of art, a symphony of agony that would echo through the halls of Magnolia Grove long after the last note had been played. The missing slaves had been practice, test subjects for the various concoctions he had been perfecting in the dark hours before dawn. Not victims of cannibalism, as the others believed, but volunteers in a sense, people who had chosen death over the continued torture of plantation life. He had given them what they wanted, what they needed, and in return, they had taught him which combinations of roots and bark and bitter leaves would bring about the specific types of suffering he required. Moses had taught him about respiratory distress, the way certain fungi could make a man's lungs fill with fluid until he drowned in his own bed. Sarah had shown him the effects of digestive poisons, compounds that would eat away at the stomach lining until every meal became an exercise in agony. The others had contributed their own lessons, their final gasps and convulsions providing valuable data for the grand experiment that was now reaching its climax. Master Blackwood had been consuming death in small doses for months, each meal adding another layer to the poison building in his system. The beauty of it was in the subtlety, the way the symptoms mimicked natural illness while actually being anything but natural. No doctor would ever suspect that the master's own appetite had been turned against him, that his greatest pleasure had become the instrument of his destruction. Charles Blackwood crouched in the shadows behind the kitchen house, his heart hammering against his ribs as he watched Jeremiah work through the window. The cook moved with practiced efficiency, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision, stirring pots that bubbled and hissed over the fire. Everything looked normal, routine, exactly as it had appeared for 15 years. But Charles had been watching for 2 hours now, and he had begun to notice things that chilled him to the bone. The way Jeremiah would pause occasionally and reach into a hidden compartment beneath his cutting board, withdrawing small vials filled with powders and liquids that definitely weren't part of any normal recipe. The way he would hold these substances up to the light, examining their colour and consistency with the careful attention of an apothecary. The way he would measure out tiny amounts with tools so precise they could only have been designed for one purpose. As Charles watched in growing horror, Jeremiah began preparing what was obviously intended to be Master Blackwood's dinner. A thick soup, rich with cream and herbs, the kind of dish his father had been craving with increasing desperation. But into this innocent-looking broth, Jeremiah began adding other things. A pinch of grey powder from one vial, 3 drops of dark liquid from another, a handful of crushed leaves that had been soaking in what looked like blood. Each addition was made with ceremonial care, as if Jeremiah were conducting a ritual rather than preparing a meal. He would add an ingredient, stir the pot 3 times clockwise, then 3 times counterclockwise, all while muttering words in a language Charles didn't recognize. The soup began to change colour, taking on a reddish tint that seemed to pulse in the firelight like a living thing. Charles had seen enough. He backed away from the window on trembling legs, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. His father wasn't simply dying of natural causes. He was being murdered, slowly and methodically, by the man they had trusted to prepare their food for over a decade. The slave who had smiled and bowed and served them faithfully was systematically poisoning the entire Blackwood family. But as he stumbled back toward the main house, Charles realized something even more terrifying. If Jeremiah had been poisoning his father for months, what had he been putting in the food the rest of the family consumed? How long had they all been slowly dying without knowing it? The thought made his stomach churn, made him question every meal, every bite, every moment of satisfaction he had experienced at Jeremiah's table. He burst through the front door of the plantation house like a man fleeing the devil himself, shouting for his brothers, for his mother, for anyone who would listen. But his voice seemed to echo strangely in the familiar halls. And when Robert and William appeared at the top of the stairs, their faces ken and rimmed with dark circles that words tumbling out in a rush of Charles had never noticed before. We in the lamplight, their eyes' son looked pale and drawn, gasped. They're all dying. He terror and realization. Jeremiah the cook. He's been poisoning us. All saw him. I watched him add of us. Things that aren't things to fathers, souped the stairs slowly. His hand gripping that food, things that are meant to kill. Robert descend banister as if he needed it for support. Are you certain? Are you absolutely certain of what you saw? I watched him for 2 hours, Charles replied, his voice hoarse with fear and exhaustion. He has vials hidden in thaders and liquids that he's been adding kitchen, dozens of them, filled with pow to our food. Father isn't sick, Robert. He's being murdered, and we're all next their ancestral home, the Waite. The 3 brothers stood in the foyer of them, The portraits of their ancestors seemed to watch shroud, a round of this terrible knowledge settling over them, like a burial to happen under their own roof. If judging them for allowing such a thing with disapproving eyes, as the house that had sheltered their racked like a boy's. What? William, the youngest, broke the silence with family for generations, suddenly felt like a tomb, a voice that Carr consumed and poisons absorb, filled with the ghosts of meals. Do we stop him? It do we do. How the long night was a question that would haunt them through ahead. As Master Blackwood laid, Jeremiah continued his work in the kitchen below, dying in his bed above and stirring pots that bubbled with ingredients no Christian man was ever meant to consume. The cook had become something more than a servant, more than a slave. He had become death itself, patient and methodical and absolutely unstoppable. And somewhere in the darkness of the slave quarters, Mama Ruth rocked in her chair and hummed an old song, one her grandmother had taught her about justice delayed but never denied, about debts that would always come due in the end. She knew what was happening in the big house, had known from the moment the first strange symptoms appeared. The spirits of the missing were finally getting their revenge, served hot and seasoned, with 15 years of carefully cultivated hatred. The night air carried the sound of her humming across the plantation grounds, mixing with the smoke from Jeremiah's kitchen fire and the laboured breathing of a dying master. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, new revelations, new understanding of just how far a man could fall when pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. But tonight, there was only the waiting, the watching, and the slow, inexorable march toward a justice that would be served at the point of a knife and the bottom of a bowl. The reckoning came with the first light of dawn, but not in the way the Blackwood family expected. Charles had spent the sleepless hours pacing the halls, his brothers flanking him like sentries, all three of them jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the windows. They had agreed on a plan, simple and direct. Confront Jeremiah before he could prepare the morning meal. Force him to confess, then decide his fate with the swift justice that plantation law allowed. But when they burst through the kitchen house door, weapons drawn and accusations ready on their lips, they found something that stopped them cold. The kitchen was empty, not just unoccupied, but stripped bare. Every pot, every pan, every knife and spoon had vanished overnight. The shelves that had held jars of spices and preserves stood naked and dusty, as if they had been abandoned for years rather than hours. Even the fire had been carefully extinguished, the ashes cold and scattered. Robert moved through the space like a man walking through a dream, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Where is everything?" he whispered, his voice barely carrying in the hollow room. "Where has it all gone?" The answer came from behind them, spoken in a voice they knew as well as their own heartbeats. "Gone to feed hungrier souls than yours." They spun around to find Jeremiah standing in the doorway, but he looked nothing like the subservient cook they had known for 15 years. His back was straight, his shoulders squared, his eyes burning with an intensity that made them all take a step backward. He wore the same simple clothes, the same canvas apron, but something fundamental had changed. The mask of servitude had fallen away, revealing something underneath that was both terrible and magnificent. "You," Charles stammered, raising his pistol with a shaking hand. "You poisoned our father. You've been killing him slowly, feeding him death with every meal." Jeremiah smiled then, an expression so cold and knowing that it seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "Your father has been feeding on death his entire life," he replied calmly. "I simply gave him a taste of his own medicine, seasoned with the tears of children sold away from their mothers, spiced with the blood of men worked to death in his fields." William whimpered and pressed himself against the wall, his face pale as parchment. "The missing slaves, the ones who disappeared. You killed them, didn't you? You chopped them up and fed them to us. I freed them, Jeremiah corrected, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. 7 souls who were suffering beyond endurance, 7 people your family had broken so completely that death was their only escape. I gave them peace, quick and clean, then buried them in ground that had never known the touch of chains. Robert found his voice, though it cracked like a boy's. But the food, the meat you served us. What was it really? Jeremiah's smile widened, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they had any right to be. Pork and beef, chicken and duck, exactly what you thought you were eating, but seasoned with something your kind has never tasted before. Justice. Ground into powder and stirred into every sauce, mixed into every gravy, baked into every loaf of bread. You've been consuming your own sins, gentlemen, digesting the weight of your cruelty, 1 spoonful at a time. The brothers exchanged horrified glances, each one suddenly aware of the taste in their mouths, the heaviness in their stomachs, the way their bodies had been changing in subtle ways over the past months. Fatigue that wouldn't lift, headaches that came without warning, a strange metallic taste that lingered no matter how much wine they consumed. "You're insane," Charles breathed. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Jeremiah wasn't mad. He was something far more dangerous. He was righteous. "Insanity is believing you can own another human being," Jeremiah replied, taking a step forward. The brothers instinctively moved back, their weapons useless against the moral authority that radiated from him, like heat from a forge. "Insanity is selling children to pay gambling debts, whipping men for the crime of being tired, raping women because you think their bodies belong to you along with their labor." His voice grew stronger with each word, filling the empty kitchen with echoes that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I have watched your family feast on human suffering for 15 years. I have served you meals while listening to you discuss which of my people to sell next, which ones to break, which ones to breed like livestock. You want to call me insane? Look in a mirror, gentlemen. Look at what you've become." Robert raised his rifle, his hands steadier now that anger was overtaking fear. "Enough! You're still just a slave, Jeremiah. Still just property, and property doesn't get to judge its owners." Jeremiah laughed then, a sound like breaking glass that made all 3 brothers flinch. "Property? Look around you, Robert. Do you see any chains? Do you see any shackles? The only thing that ever made me your property being afraid the moment I decided your father was going was fear, and I'm not afraid anymore. I stopped to die." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Charles tightened his grip on his pistol, his finger hovering over the trigger. "He's not dead yet. We can still save him, get him to a real doctor, somewhere far from here." "Your father is already dead," Jeremiah said with absolute certainty. "He just hasn't stopped breathing yet. The poison I've been feeding him doesn't just kill the body, it kills the soul, piece by piece, memory by memory. By now he can't remember the names of half the people he's destroyed. By tomorrow, he won't remember his own name. By the end of the week, he'll be nothing but meat and bone, kept alive only by the hatred that's been growing in his belly like a cancer." William sobbed openly now, sliding down the wall until he was sitting on the floor. "Why? Why do this to us? We gave you a good life, better than most slaves ever see. You had your own kitchen, your own authority, respect from the other servants." Jeremiah turned to look at the youngest Blackwood son, and for a moment his expression softened with something that might have been pity. "A good life? You gave me the privilege of watching you destroy everything I loved, then forced me to smile and say thank you. You made me cook the meals that fueled your strength to swing the whip, made me sharpen the knives you used to cut the hope out of people's hearts. You think that was kindness? You think I should be grateful?" He moved closer to William, crouching down until they were eye to eye. "Let me tell you about kindness, boy. Kindness is what I showed Moses when I held his hand as he died. whispering prayers in his ear instead of letting him choke on his own blood in some cotton field. Kindness is what I showed Sarah when I gave her peace, instead of letting your father's friends take turns with her broken body. Kindness is what I'm showing your father right now, giving him a death that matches his life, slow and full of suffering, but at least honest about what it is. Robert and Charles moved simultaneously, both raising their weapons, both knowing that this conversation had moved beyond threats and into the realm of judgment. But Jeremiah was already rising folds of his apron to withdraw something, already moving, his hand reaching into the F that gleamed in the morning light streaming through the kitchen windows. It wasn't a weapon, not exactly. It was a ladle, long-handled and well-used, the same utensil he had used to serve countless meals to the Blackwood family over the years. But in his hand, it looked different. It looked like a scepter, like a symbol of authority that had been earned through years of patient service and careful planning. "You want to shoot me?" he asked, his voice calm as still water. "Go ahead. Pull those triggers. But know this, when you do, you'll be killing the only person who knows the antidote to what's flowing through your veins right now. You think I've been poisoning just your father. You think I've been serving you clean food while slowly murdering him. Gentlemen, you've been dying alongside him from the very first meal I prepared after I decided it was time for the Blackwood family to pay their debts." The weapons wavered in their hands, doubt creeping in like fog at sunset. Robert's face had gone ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Charles doubled over suddenly, clutching his stomach as waves of nausea washed over him. Even William, still sitting on the floor, began to notice the way his heart was racing, the way his vision seemed to blur around the edges. "You're lying!" Robert gasped, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're trying to scare us, make us think we're sick when we're not." Jeremiah tilted his head, studying them with the detached interest of a physician examining symptoms. "Am I? Tell me, Robert, when did you last sleep through the night without waking up in cold sweats? Charles, when did you last eat a meal without that metallic taste coating your tongue? William, when did you last look in a mirror and recognize the face looking back at you?" The questions hit like physical blows, each one highlighting symptoms they had been ignoring, changes they had attributed to stress or worry or the natural effects of their father's illness. But now, seen in this new light, the pattern was undeniable. They were all sick, all dying, all victims of a revenge so patient and methodical that it had taken months to fully appreciate its scope. "The antidote," Charles whispered, his knees buckling as another wave of nausea crashed over him. "If there is one, if you're telling the truth, what do you want for it?" Jeremiah's smile returned, cold and terrible, and absolutely without mercy. "What do I want? I want your father to suffer as he has made others suffer. I want him to die knowing that his legacy will die with him, that the Blackwood name will be remembered only as a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. I want you three to understand what it feels like to be helpless, to have your fate decided by someone who has every reason to hate you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over them like a burial shroud. "But most of all, I want you to know that this isn't about revenge anymore. This is about balance. This is about settling accounts that have been overdue for far too long. Your family has consumed so much suffering, caused so much pain, that the universe itself has bent to ensure that debt is paid." The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of laboured breathing and William's quiet sobbing. Outside, the plantation was stirring to life, field hands moving toward the cotton rows, house servants beginning their daily routines, all of them unaware that the world they knew was ending in a stripped bare kitchen where justice finally wore a human face. Jeremiah looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, their fear, their growing understanding of what true helplessness felt like. "There is no antidote," he said finally, his voice gentle now, almost kind. there never was. Some debts can only be paid in full, and yours has been accumulating interest for 15 years. The last thing any of them saw before the poison finally claimed their consciousness was Jeremiah walking out of the empty kitchen, the ladle still in his hand, humming an old song about freedom that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. History buried the truth about Jeremiah Brooks beneath layers of scandal and whispered accusations. The newspapers called it the Magnolia Grove tragedy, blaming contaminated well water for the mysterious deaths of the Blackwood family. They said it was cholera, maybe typhus, anything that wouldn't force them to confront the possibility that a slave had systematically destroyed one of Mississippi's most prominent plantation dynasties. The official records show no mention of poison, no investigation into missing cookware, no questions about the cook who vanished the same night 4 white men died in agony. But in the quarters, among the people whose names were never written in ledgers, the story lived on. They spoke of Jeremiah not as a monster, but as an instrument of something larger than revenge. He became a whispered promise that cruelty would not go unanswered forever, that patience could be as deadly as any blade, that even the most powerless person could find a way to balance the scales. They said he walked south toward New Orleans, carrying his knowledge of herbs and roots and the precise measurements of justice. They said he found work in other kitchens, other plantation houses, always watching, always waiting, always ready to serve the final meal when the time was right. The rumors about cannibalism faded into legend, but the truth was far more terrifying than any ghost story. Jeremiah had proven that the master's table could become his grave, that the very act of consumption could be turned into an act of judgment. He showed that a man with nothing but knowledge and patience could bring down an empire built on suffering, one carefully seasoned dish at a time. The Blackwood plantation was abandoned within a year, the fields returning to wild growth, the house slowly consumed by vines and weather. But sometimes on certain nights when the wind blows just right across the Mississippi cotton country, people say you can still smell something cooking in the ruins of that empty kitchen. Not food exactly, but something deeper. Something that tastes like memory and burns like truth. The kind of meal that reminds you some debts can never be forgiven, only paid in full. If this story stirred something in your blood, something that tastes like justice long delayed, then you understand why these names must not be forgotten. Subscribe to keep these truths alive. Share this story with those who need to hear it. And remember that history is written by those brave enough to speak the names the world tried to bury.